We've all been there. You're in the middle of a dungeon when the GM tells you to roll initiative. The excitement of battle unfolds as turn after turn passes. After your table realizes it has been stuck in combat for a couple hours at this point, the smiles dissolve. Frustrations set in. The fight has been fun, sure, but it's been long. Eventually, players get up and begin to pace. The GM can't just cancel the rest of the fight after all, so you're stuck in for the duration. So, what causes combat to take forever? And what can you do as a GM or as a player to keep things moving? Starblade answers these questions and more tonight on Playing God. I'm Nick Logie, and with me is Xander. I've managed to die during character creation, Nolan.
Hey, man.
Combat. Most tabletop role playing games revolve around it, so expediting certain aspects lets you get more out of your combats and the time to fit more of them in too. Xander, let's go through some basic time savers before diving into the more esoteric advice. What is something that both players and GMs can do to speed things along without compromising fun or rushing?
Well, the first thing that it comes down to is the dice. The dice, the dice, the dice. Roll your damage dice with the attack. Have all of your dice set up so that you can have a quick and easy access to them. So you'll have a d20 plus your damage dice for your attacks that are just sitting in one spot. So you don't have to go fishing through your dice bag I need to find a d4. You've already got it. It's sitting there. Those few seconds that you shave off with rolling all the dice together add up really fast when you've got 2 to 3, maybe 4 attacks per player, plus all of the stuff to do with the GM. It saves minutes upon minutes, and it stacks really, really fast.
Yeah, and this is physically picking up your d20, and let's say you're just rolling with the longsword. You pick up the d20 and the d8, and then you both roll them at the same time. If
Yep.
the attack misses, whatever the d8 says just doesn't matter. But if it hits, then you have your damage, and you could just be like, I hit, I do 12 damage. All right, there you go. I would hope that you have more role play and explanation with that, other than just be like, I hit and do 12 damage. But that's just me.
Yeah.
I've actually had players in some games where they will, for like a big spell, like a fireball, for instance, they will have a pile of specific d6s that they have set aside that they won't touch until they need to use that spell. And then once they do, they just pick up that horde of shit and the d20, and, well, if it requires the d20, and huck it. And, there you go.
That's also an excuse to buy more dice, because you'll need multiple sets for different attacks and different spells and stuff like that. So, you can get a set of red d6s and red d8s to go for all of your fire-based spells, and then you have a set of blue ones that's for all of your ice damage and stuff like that. And then it just makes things easy to identify. You can grab them up quick and just toss them into the rolling tray.
It saves a lot of time. And one thing you want to not do when you do this, because I know the urge will be there, and I know that I want to do this too sometimes, and it's whatever you see come up on the damage dice or however this ends up going, don't speculate on what could have happened. So if you like roll this big attack with like 20 d6s, but you miss, don't be like, don't count them up anyway and say like, oh man, this would have like done like half the enemy's health and damage or whatever, and then we could have done this, this, and this. Like that just ruins all the time you just saved.
Yep, derailed immediately. Another thing that as a DM, because
This is specific to DMs.
This is specific to DMs, is just take the average damage instead of rolling. We love rolling dice. Really love rolling dice.
So that's why I really don't use this technique.
No, it's why
But no,
I
but
do.
here's why it's useful, because usually the monster stat itself, and in 5th ed this I think is the case, because I don't do this. They have the actual like average just next to the damage, so you could just say if you hit, then whatever, if they hit, they do the same amount of damage every single time. It's a little gamey, and your players might be able to catch on to the fact that you're doing that, but it also can give them a consistent experience, because it's like if you're attacking one monster, it doesn't have a wild variation on what it can do. You should expect that from the players, maybe not the monsters.
Yeah. Also, you can kind of mix and match as per needed. With something like a big combat that is going to last some time, and the monster has multiple attacks, use the average and then do different attacks. And maybe they'll eventually pick up that every time they swing that one sword, it does 10 damage plus 5 poison damage. It does it every single round, and but by the time that combat is over, it's no longer relevant. But if you have like say a bar fight and there's two dudes in there, and it's going to like take 20-30 minutes, it's not a huge combat that's going to take hours upon hours, then yeah, sure, go ahead, roll the dice. You don't have to worry about saving time at that point. It's just for the bigger, more lengthy combats that have multiple attacks and multiple enemies and things of that nature. There are other ways to spice things up than rolling dice for every single one of them, because it's kind of a pain.
Let's talk about a classic example that we've probably all seen at some point during our roleplay experiences. You're fighting an undead army. Now, as a GM, you don't want to have to roll dice every single goddamn time you want your skeletons to attack, because that's easily like probably 20 rolls in just one encounter versus a player when it's their turn.
Or
They
more.
just move up. Yeah, or more. Like, 20 is just a big number it came up with, but it could be way huger than that.
Yeah.
So, like, if you have your skeleton army, but you have, like, a lich backing them up or some other big part of this fight, they will roll whatever it is normally. But the skeletons, whatever their average damage is, which, I don't know, maybe like a 3 or a 4, would just be my guess off the top of my head. You just take that as a 3 or 4, because there's not going to be much variation with, like, a D4 or a D6. Because that's all you're really doing when you're rolling dice. You're just selecting a range of numbers that you're trying to get the damage for.
Yeah.
So, like a D6 is, without any modifiers, is going to range from 1 to 6, with the average being 3. Well, technically it's like 3.5 or something like that. But
Yeah.
that's just the range of it. With a D8, it's 1 to 8. But then when you start adding modifiers, that changes the range, even if it doesn't change the dice. So the D6, if you add a +2 to that, like with whatever you do, the range is now 3 to 8. And that's the damage you're going to do. So it doesn't really matter about that level of math and statistics when it comes to your teeny tiny little crunchy dudes who you're throwing at the players and you're expecting them all to blow up and die.
Yeah, one hit dudes.
Yeah, and you could even change their HP to be applicable to that kind of gameplay. Like in 4th edition, there was like the minion class of monsters where they all just technically had 1 HP. Really, it's just if they got hit, they die, so you could fight a bunch of shit, which is perfect for. You could integrate that into 5th edition. Just have everybody have 1 HP, like all these skeletons. Like if they get hit by a player, just have them go down. Like if they have 12 HP each, do you want to sit there and write down every single time they're hit and then keep track of like 30 different individually statted skeletons? No. Nobody wants to do that.
Also, another way to save time for mass combat, specifically for mass combat with a bunch of crunchy things like those skeletons we've been talking about, is instead of sitting down and rolling a d20 for each one of them to figure out whether or not they hit, let's say you've got 20 skeletons, and you can roll a d4 and be like, okay, so you roll a d4 to see how many of the skeletons will be quote unquote attempting to the attack, and it's 5, 10, 15, or on a 4 all 20, and then roll like 2, maybe 3 attack rolls, and let's say if 1 hits but 2 miss, then 2, maybe 3 of the skeletons do some damage. They select a couple party members, and then you're done. Instead of having to go, all right, skeleton 1, skeleton 2, skeleton 3.
So they
4,
actually
blah, 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 blah.
they actually have. I don't know. I don't think it's exactly that, but they have that in the GM handbook in 5th edition. Like it tells you, it tells you like this percentage of shit hits. This is the amount of damage that they'll take based on the size of this group. That's also why when you're reading initiative, like as the GM, you don't roll every one of your dudes individually. You actually roll groupings of monsters. So because they all basically have the same stats. So if you have zombies, skeletons, and a lich, then you only roll initiative 3 times. You roll once for all of the zombies, once for all of the skeletons, and then once for the lich. And that's why it's grouped. Partially why it's grouped that way. Because then when the skeletons all move en masse towards something, then you could just do that mass combat damage resolution.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, hey, a DM who learned something new. There we go. That's something that I did not know was in the handbook. So there we go.
And you don't have to follow the handbook exactly. Like Xander's method would work just as fine, or like even something you come up with yourself. As long as it's consistent, it's fair, and it works, then that's pretty much all you really need.
Yeah, consistency is key here, guys.
So speaking of consistency, let's talk about having your players and making sure they actually do this fill out their character sheets all the way.
All the
So,
way.
Xander, give us a rundown of why that's important.
Okay. I'm a barbarian, right? And I'm sitting here at the head of the table, and I'm about to make an attack roll. It's like the third game. I'm still new to D&D, and I look down at my character sheet, and I'm looking around. I know I've got a great sword, but DM, how much does a great sword do? Oh, it's a D12, or wait, no, or two D6s.
It's 2d6s.
I don't know which one. No, I don't.
Well, that'd be the GM telling him like it's 2d6.
Yep, it's two D6s. Oh, okay. Well, I'm gonna use my great sword, and that's two D6s for damage, right? All right. I'm gonna go ahead and attack, and I have 15. No, on the die. There's my strength bonus is +4.
I'm gonna actually cut off this example now because I'm getting frustrated listening to this example.
Imagine that shit at your table.
That's a real thing that could happen. Like, people don't know what their modifiers are, and like this could go far beyond a new player too. Like, I don't care if this is the first game they've ever played or if they've been playing the game for 16 levels and they didn't check off any of their saving throws proficiencies.
Yep.
Which increased their power level by like
a lot.
Incredible amount. I can't believe it. But new, old, experienced players, doesn't matter. They need to fill out like everything that they can on there.
That little bit right there can take so much time into a game, and it will drive you absolutely batty. Just the example where I was just miming being in that combat drove Nick up the walls, and I knew it was going to. It was kind of fun. But an easy way to do that is off to the left-hand side of your character sheet, or off to the right-hand side of your character sheet, or your character sheet probably has a place for this already.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is filling out the actual character sheet. There is something that Xander's getting at that is a piece of advice that I use myself. But we're not there yet. What we're here with, this is like, okay, if you roll your stats, you have like, what's a random array? Like 12, 13, 10, 10, 10, 15. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you have those, write your goddamn modifiers next to them where there's a spot for it. Because then you don't have to be like, I have 13 Constitution. What do I have a bonus in? It's a plus one. You just have that on the character sheet, and then you could just glance at it if you need to, and then you go. Mm-hmm. Now I know we got a little hung up on just filling out your character sheet, which is everybody who's listening, I'm sure is thinking like, yeah, you're supposed to do that at character creation. But we've all been at a table where somebody didn't write their spells down, somebody didn't write like feats, or like especially when it comes to like teamwork feats from some editions of D&D, where if you don't know you have it, then the other person who has that teamwork feat never gets to use it because you never use it.
Precisely. Another thing that can happen, and this is where you typically see it happen to even more experienced players, when you level up. You get a proficiency bonus increase, but you're not paying attention to the chart when you level your character. You literally just gimped yourself. And just, if you have all of your totals and you know what everything is supposed to be, you will always have a +8 to hit with this great sword. So you roll the die, add 8 to it. You don't have to micromanage and figure out which is your dex, which is your bonus, blah, blah, blah. You know, if you fill your character sheet all the way out, there are spots on your character sheet, especially in 5th edition, that are literally designed to do this exact same thing. And if you ignore those things, you're holding up combat, you're holding up the story, you're frustrating the other players around the table, and you're driving your GM up the side of the house that you're in. Outside, not up a wall inside, but outside the house. He's losing his damn mind.
What's the GM's climb speed? 20 feet?
At that, it'd be like 75 feet. Because he's going up and over the house.
So let's say you're somebody who has a problem, like, doing this. Like, I know it sounded like we just yelled at you a bunch, but, like, I know this is hard because it's a game where the rule books are like 500 fucking pages, and there's a lot to take in. So this is why, here's a trick that I would probably suggest, and that is just really focus on the character sheet when you're like creating the character, and then you don't have to really worry about it until you level up. Then refocus as hard as you can on it to make sure it's all right, because then you don't have to worry about it afterwards. Then you could just be like, yep, got a +10 to hit, roll the dice and your damage dice at the same time, and then There you go. You just know what it is, and then when you get to the next level up and something changes, then you can during your focus point, then you're like, okay, this is different from what's on the chart in the book. So I'm gonna change this, and I'm gonna change this, and then after that, just wait for your next level up because you've already made the changes and you're good to go.
Yep. And now, where filling out your character sheets and all that, there are some things that no matter how much space you have in a character sheet, you just can't fill it all the way out. Like some of your class features or feats and things like that.
If you're a wizard and you have a bunch of spells, that's literally just not gonna fit on the page.
Oh no, absolutely not. There are tools that you can use to do this. The first and probably the easiest and definitely the cheapest, get a scrap piece of notebook paper and write down what each of the abilities on your character sheet is. That way, while you're in combat, you can be, when it's not your turn, you can be looking at all of your abilities and be like, all right, I've got this, 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 and that would be really good for next turn. Because you have everything right there. You're not trying to flip through the book and figure something out. You've got everything already there. Or alternatively, which is would require a drive to a store, probably a Barnes and Noble.
I mean, we got Amazon. Whatever it is coming the same day now. Like, let's go.
Yeah. There are, for D&D 5th edition specifically, if you're playing that game, I don't know if these exist for other games, but you can actually get cards that have all of the spells in it. So you just pick out the cards that have the spells that you need. So you have an array of these cards right here. You're like, all right, I need to cast this spell. You pick up the card, you read it out loud for the GM, because the GM also doesn't want to have to deal with all of that crap.
No, you should not let the GM have to memorize everything that your character can do.
Yep, it is your responsibility to do that.
But the cards are a good suggestion. In fact, a lot of games do that, Xander. So D&D is like the big one because it's just hella popular. But like there are different kind of cards for a variety of games. Like there are spell cards in pretty much most games that are out, which are very classic because they have all the information of the spell that you're casting just on the card itself, which is great. What I like to do with cards, because I didn't realize how great cards were until I guess it was a playtest, like a playtest for a game called Legion, which is based off of 3.5 Pathfinder kind of rule set, but it's like heavily tweaked. And it involves space, which is great for me. So when I was there, the guy who made the game, they actually did have a full set of printed like actual like glossed cards and everything like that. That's why I didn't really want to call it a play test because this shit's out. You can just find it online. But it was a test for me at least. And so I just laid out all these cards like basically side by side, and I was like, wait, hold on, I can just look at all of my shit at a glance? Because originally what I would do is, for one of my characters in Pathfinder, I made an actual spell book to have my spells in just like he had in the game. I even had like little symbols and pictures and shit. I had like some arcane writing just for flavor and to not bog down like the rules chunk of the page that just told me what my spell is. But this is why I wasn't flipping through the player's handbook to actually like find the page that the spell was on. This one I had it set up so it was just like each page was one spell, just cut like how it is in the game, or at least in older versions of D&D. And so I flipped to that page. Okay, that's what this thing does. I'm using that. And then I would write down like the damage that I would roll. I would write down everything that you would find in the player's handbook itself, verbatim throughout the entire page. So that way, there was no confusion on what was going on. And that way, if a GM or the GM I was with at the time ever was like, what is this? Where did you get this? I could just pull open the page of the book, which I actually did write down the page of the book I found it on. So I could be like, look, this is the exact same thing. So that way I wouldn't misinterpret the rules. And that way you could just straight up see what the text is. It was all handwritten notes, which is why it was a little sketchy, but it worked out. And so I would definitely recommend cards because there's not just spells. There's also, I think can you get feats? Like feat cards?
You can get feats. You can get class features and abilities. You can even get racial abilities. They have all of them. They even have different box sets for the different spell classes. So there's one for druids, one for sorcerers, one for wizards, one for everything. There's even one for just warlocks. So yeah, totally. They're like anywhere from $7 to $15, and it will save you 1,000% of all your time.
Yeah. Now,
really
there's maybe one stipulation I have for this, and that is the fact that you'd have to buy multiple packs of cards to get like more than one class and all that. Personally, I switch classes and shit so many times that it would be like, well, this deck of cards is useless now, so let me play this sorcerer for like 3 years. And then when that's done, well, these cards are basically useless now because I'm not going to play a sorcerer again for a long ass time. That's just me, though. If you're one of the people who likes a specific or a particular kind of class, then
A
hell
lot of
yeah,
people
go
do.
for it. Yeah, like more
Yeah.
power to
Also,
you.
if you are a player and also a GM, having those at the ready for as a GM, you notice that I've got cards from all the classes and stuff because I like playing all the classes. I've collected them over like 12 years. Oh, hey, this character has this ability. Well, I'm just going to grab the card from my box here, stick it down there, and now you have all the stuff for all of your NPCs and your monsters too. So, hey.
That's a good suggestion. So, quick reference materials are great. Something that I do myself is on the character sheet itself. Even though I know there are places for this, I sometimes find it easier at a glance to do it. As I'll rewrite like my own like little sections where it's so it's away from the clutter of the rest of the character sheet. Maybe even on like the back of the character sheet where it's blank. And then I would write down like some like certain bonuses. Like if my character attacks with a bow, I would have basically I'd write down bow attack, and then it's plus whatever, and then the damage, however many D whatevers that they're there. That way, all I have to do is
Yep.
just glance at it real quick and be done with it. I don't have to see all the breakdowns of where all those numbers came from because we already did that in the paying attention and filling out your character sheet section. So
Yep.
so I just write that down as a quick thing, and then I'll update that over the course of like my level ups as well. So that's just a
Yep.
little something I do. Maybe like write like a different like my HP or like a temp HP thing. Maybe the temporary modifiers might go on where this is instead of next to the attributes, because temporary modifiers are very rare nowadays. I think,
Yeah, they're pretty rare in 5th edition.
which is
So,
fine. I don't like fucking
yeah.
around with people's base stats because that just makes you do a lot more. Even though it's simple, a lot more math.
And it's also a lot more work for the GM to try and keep track of. Okay, you only have this for 3 rounds,
Oh yeah,
and then 4 rounds comes along, and you're like, all right, that's no longer applying. And you're like, oh, I forgot. Yeah,
or the GM like rolls an attack and they're like, oh shit, I guess I didn't hit you. But then there's like, oh wait, no, but I hit you with that level drain 2 turns ago, which is gonna last until you use a greater restoration, which means that I actually do hit you. So then there's like that's some deliberation you could ignore if you don't use all these modifiers. But that's more of a core rule set kind of thing rather than just a DM preference.
yeah. And also remember, children, this applies to your online games too, because just because all the fancy character sheets on Roll20 have all the little bits of math and stuff here and there done for you, there's still stuff you've got to do. Pay attention, please. Make your GM's life 1,000 times easier.
All right, so let's go into what I think is my personal biggest problem with
Here we go.
with time management. I put this in all caps, and I'm going to say it in all caps too. Pay attention. What do I mean by this? I mean that when it's your turn, when it's not your turn, when the GM is just explaining stuff, whatever it is, pay attention. Like, listen to what is being said. So I put this in because everybody has to deal with this at some point. Like, it gets to a player's turn, and they usually ask always the same question: "What happened?" Like at the start of their turn, and it like you wouldn't have to ask this if you were just listening. Now, the generic "what happened" is different from like asking specific questions on something like maybe you didn't understand it. This is like you get to somebody's turn and you're like, and they just say, "Could you tell me what happened like before until it got to my turn?" And it's like if you weren't paying attention, we're just recapping. Like straight up wasting our time recapping for like 5 minutes about what took place over the last 20 minutes.
Yep.
Just listen. Honestly, I think this is why most people prefer like grids and minis to theater of the mind, because in my experience, if people are actually like listening and like trying to visualize what's going on, then there wouldn't be as much confusion. Sure, there'll be questions, obviously, but there'd be less confusion even about things like positioning and like where spells are being cast and stuff like that.
Yeah, it can get to be a little bit tedious. Now, there's a side flip to this. If you have your turn and you do your thing, The first thing you should do immediately after your turn, while still trying to keep an ear out towards the DM and the other players, the next player in, you should take their turn to plan out your next turn. And then once you have your plan, keep it in the back of your mind and then watch what's happening around. That way you're not spending the entirety of the turns of everybody else at the table trying to figure out what you're going to do with your next turn and then being left completely, flabbergasted about what's going on because you spent the entirety of the time trying to come up with the most clever way of fixing the problem, but then the problem's no longer a problem. You'll get better at this over time, but try to limit yourself to just the person's turn that's immediately after your turn for your planning for the next phase of the combat, and then adjust. That way, as you're going around the table, your plan can alter and shift to incorporate some of the things that might have changed during the field of combat. But just pay attention, please. Please.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that, Xander.
I have seven players at my table. It would be 1,000 years if they didn't all pay attention.
It also helps. Let's talk about the more positive aspects of paying attention other than just the time-saving aspect. The one thing that comes immediately to mind is that it keeps people invested in the game. Like, So say you're like reading a book or watching a movie or something like that, and there's this cool action scene going on. Like, no matter how lengthy it might be described in like the text, like you're able to follow along with it because it's very like personal. And if you're actually listening to what's going on at the table and you're still imagining yourself as your character even if it isn't your turn and it's kind of like a time freeze situation for you, then that helps you interpret like what the character will do, and basically you wouldn't have to sit and actually plan out your turn because you're kind of listening to what everybody else is doing, and you're encouraging your other players to also not really just pay attention but like have the same level of investment because like when their turns happen they'll be more excited about taking their turn. It'll be a lot clearer what happened. Because if somebody just has to have a recap, then by the time the recap is done, maybe the other players have kind of like gotten muddied as to what happened. Even though they did have a recap, maybe it played out a little differently in how like they pictured it in their head. Mechanically on like the table and the grid and all that, it stays the same. But that can really affect somebody's experience, including your own. I would much rather have like the agency to just get to my turn and say, all right, since I saw like the paladin revive the fighter, but somebody's coming up to like sneak attack the paladin, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, since I already have my blade drawn, I'm going to tuck and roll past these two individuals that I'm fighting, and then I'm going to go stab the thing that's sneaking up on the paladin instead. Then, like, because the paladin's like, oh shit, like, because he can't do anything about it because it's not his turn anymore, and you're like, oh fuck yeah, I'm gonna save him, but you also have to kind of weigh the consequences of not using the disengage action and just trying to roll past your dudes that you're fighting to save this guy, which will bring a lot to the roleplay aspect of it because it would show your character, if they're inclined to do so, is willing to sacrifice themselves to at least some extent to help the party.
Yeah. It increases your investment in everything that's going on and how much you care about even the other player characters. Another thing where paying attention can be an issue is if you are the player that says, what happened? Because you were looking down at your phone the entirety of the combat and its turns come back around to you. The other players at the table have to sit down and listen.
Yeah, their game experience gets completely broken right then and there.
Their immersion's gone. Their investment in the story is also suspended. And then they are sitting there like, I already know what happened. They pull out their phones, and it's just a completely cyclical problem that can ruin the entirety of the table's feel. You'll no longer want to be in the combat. It'll take much longer, and everyone will be over it before the combat is even over with, even if in the beginning they were all into it, simply because one person wasn't paying attention. Yeah, it takes one player.
The hardest part of the combat should not be running the combat. The hardest part of the combat should be overcoming the challenge that you are presented as a character.
Yes. And if your DM is doing their job and making the encounter challenging, and the hardest part of the combat stops being, figuring out how to deal with this issue, that is in play to dealing with an issue that is out of play, it could also have some negative consequences on the fact that maybe more characters might get downed in this combat than the DM was expecting.
That's true.
That's
That's actually raises a great point. Like if a player it misses something that is crucial, like how an enemy behaves, like maybe they're fighting something that's completely immune to fire, and that your fire wizard hasn't been paying attention when like the fighter with the flaming sword hits this creature and it doesn't do any fire damage, and then they cast like scorching ray or something like that, and they do no damage. Not only have they wasted their turn, but they put the party in danger.
and also wasted their spell slots.
They also wasted their spell slots and people's time.
Mm-hmm. So paying attention is absolutely paramount. We all gather around the table to have a good time, to have some fun, and if it's a pretzels and beer kind of game, then it's a pretzels and beer kind of game. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention.
Now there is kind of a stipulation to this that I just thought of, and that is if your character can't pay attention in play, then you can basically voluntarily not pay attention out of play. I wouldn't recommend doing that just because it's fun to listen to what's going on, and you're not going to metagame, so whatever. But if your like character is nowhere near the combat, maybe that is a good time to like step away or like check something on your phone, which maybe your GM might not even allow your phone to be there, but let's say that this pretty lax. This is a good time to do that kind of thing, or check a character sheet or whatever you were going to do that was distracting anyway. Because you're literally not paying attention in play. You can't perceive what's going on.
Yeah, this is also a great time to, instead of having a sanctioned 5-minute break in the middle of the combat, which can sometimes disrupt whether or not combat goes smoothly because people will forget things that happened in the last turns and stuff like that. This would be the perfect opportunity to get up, go grab a soda for everybody that's sitting at the table that is in the combat and it can't get up to go and do it. This is a good time to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Now, as a GM, so here's something as a GM that is up to you, but here's your options basically. You have the option if you have a situation like this where the character can't perceive what's going on. You can make the player leave and not be able to perceive what's going on, which has happened to me before, and it was cool. I could see. That's why I put this as a choice and not a you should or shouldn't do one thing or the other. There was one time when I was playing Dark Heresy, and my character, a psyker, rolled Perils of the Warp because I have awful luck. And this is a different Perils story, by the way, Xander, than the one I told you. This one, what happened was I accidentally blurped out of existence for 30 in-game seconds, which is forever in Dark Heresy, by the way. And,
it's also forever in a combat encounter,
yeah,
too.
it's also a long-ass time
like,
regularly.
What, 5 turns?
Yeah, so I vanished from reality just entirely for that amount of time. So our GM, he said, okay, could you just step outside for like a few minutes while we do what happens in between this? Because we all knew when I was coming back. Is in the rules that I was gone for 30 seconds specifically. And so I went outside and I waited for like maybe 5-ish minutes, just kind of hanging out. It was a nice evening, and so whatever. So then I went to go back in. Nobody'd come to get me yet. But when I went back in, then they were still doing that 30 seconds. So I was actually a little miffed at that point because I was like, come on, guys, I want to get back into this game. I'm like, just because I rolled bad doesn't mean I should have to leave. But I was like, okay, whatever. Like, they're doing the thing. And then I went back outside. I think the totality of my wait time was like 10 or 12 minutes. So when I finally got back in, this is the reason why I said it was cool. When I got back in, the situation that I got back into was nowhere close to the one that I left. So I disappeared when me and the 2 other party members were surrounded by hive scum who were like part of this. I can't remember what exactly were they doing, but we were surrounded by all these dudes, and I was like, I'm gonna cast this psychic power, and so I blurped out of existence. And when I came back, everything was on fire, including the people. Jesse's character, he had burned his hair off. His clothes were in tatters. Like, the other character was holding a fucking sword hilt at somebody that he had put a single-use flamer round into, so he could shoot everybody with more fire if he needed to. And I came back, I was like, what the fuck happened? And I had to catch back up, and all the guys were like, "We give up. We don't want to deal with whatever you guys are." You had 2 people on your team, and they fucked us up. Whoever this magic third guy is, we definitely want none of this.
Because he's just been gone for 30
Because
seconds.
I disappeared out of reality, and I have magic basically in a universe where nobody wants to have magic.
Yeah, no.
So I come in, they're just like, "Nope, fuck this. We're done."
Yeah.
So that's something you could do as a GM. You could have your player leave or not, but take the story for what you will. And then if you think it's a cool idea, then kick your player out. And if you just want to keep him there, then sure, go ahead and do that. Make sure it's cool with the
Yeah.
player, though. Really, I guess that's what it comes down
Yeah.
to.
And also, if you're going to have a long, drawn out combat that could last a couple of hours and stuff like that, don't have your party split to where half of them know what's going on and half of them don't. Like, try to
Yeah.
get everybody there before the combat begins.
Now you could split the party and have 2 kind of separate combats going, but don't kick people out of the fucking table and resolve
Yeah,
like
no,
one
because
entire
they'll be
thing.
out for 2 hours and they'll just be like, ugh.
Easy. They may as well not have shown up for the game, probably.
I just wanted to go buy a new cloak, man. That's all I wanted to do.
We'll move on from the paying attention aspect of it and this kind of stuff. So
We think you got it.
we think you got it, especially when I yelled "pay attention" at the beginning of the whole thing. This next part, this is why we're saving like the more esoteric stuff for now that we're later in the episode, because these are these are not hard and fast rules. These aren't mechanical things. These are suggestions and just general advice and ideas for what you can use in your own games. So,
Yeah.
one thing that you can do, depending on the situation, is you can limit the amount of questions people can ask during their turn. I want you to be careful with this because I'm not saying you have 5 questions to ask. I'm saying, like, if somebody starts asking about maybe like the motivations or something that's completely irrelevant to the literal what's happening this turn combat, don't let them ask that question.
But, if they're like, hey, Nick, what are the walls made of? That's totally cool. That's
No, it's
totally
not.
cool.
No, if you ask me what the
Totally
fucking
cool.
walls are made of again, I'm killing your. The walls fall and you die. That's what they're made of.
I actually asked Nick at one combat, because we're out in the desert and I'm on top of this sandstone building, and I'm like, all right, Nick, is there a lip to this the top of this building? Because it's made of sandstone. Sometimes there's a lip up there.
They're by the way, they're in the middle of a citywide raid where
Yeah.
like these bandit enemies effectively were raiding this relatively small town. So this just came out of fucking nowhere for me.
Like, yeah, there's a lip there.
It's like, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
that's a sandstone thing. It's got a lip or whatever. Why?
Why do you want to know? It's like, all right, Nick. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run forward. I'm gonna kick the shit out of one of these bricks and beam somebody in the head with it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, like
And it worked out too.
it was great. That was a super cool moment in the fight, especially since you rolled well and managed to pull off that nonsense.
Yeah,
That's
that
the important
nonsense
bit.
is always fun.
So when I'm saying limiting questions, I'm not talking about just like observational questions. Like that was a perfect example. What are the walls made of?
Yeah.
When I say observational, I'm thinking of things that your character can perceive then and there and interpret it immediately. Because just because you could see something doesn't mean you immediately interpret it. Like if you see writing on the wall and you don't immediately recognize the language, you don't get to ask the question of what language is this written in if you can't read it. So you don't know because you don't have time to fucking pull out your dictionary and figure it out. You have time. You have time to shoot this fucker right in the face because he's in front of you trying to stab you.
Yeah.
So this is something like, what is that guy standing in front of me gonna stab me with? It's like it's a knife. It's a cyber knife because why not? Or it's like, what kind of armor is this monster wearing?
Yeah, things that you can observe quickly, and D&D rules are that every round lasts about 6 seconds for the purposes of like timed spells and things of that nature. So a good way to look at it is, as a DM, if somebody asks you a question, you can turn and look at the player and be like, "Can you tell me if you could observe this within 6 seconds?" And I would count it out. And generally they'll either be like, "Oh no, I can totally, figure out whether or not this thing is made of hickory in 6 seconds." Okay, cool. Then it is not made of hickory, blah, blah, blah. But if it's anything like, what's the paragraph on that bulletin board say? Can you read that in 6 seconds? Well, maybe. I mean, it depends on the person, obviously.
If you're playing the game Fatal, you can find that out because that's a stat. Don't play Fatal, by the way. Never play Fatal. But it's straight up a stat, Xander. There's like how fast you can read, how many words you can say per round, and what is your anal circumference.
That's anal circumference.
That's the anal circumference game, man.
Roll for anal circumference.
Or what? I don't know if I might like this better. There's a spell side effect where it says increase your ball sack size by 2d10, and it doesn't tell you what the metric is. So it could be 2d10 inches, miles, galaxies. I don't know.
I saw by 2d10 miles. Suddenly, your ball sack is covering the entire tri-state area.
It's such a bad game. You should read the rules just to see how fucking hilarious and terrible it is. Don't actually try playing the game. It's almost impossible. but okay, so it's such a funny fucking terrible ass game, man. I don't even know what we're talking about.
Limited amount of questions and stuff like that. Observational abilities.
Oh wait, that's right. If you want kind of like a frame of reference for what we're talking about, go like online, or maybe you have something on like a console or something where it's like one of those brain training games or like memory games where it'll show you something on screen for like a few seconds, and then it'll basically ask you everything that was on the screen. And if you do that and you're like, oh, I can't do this in real life, then that's a good frame of reference that you're not going to be able to do something that complicated in a combat situation as your character.
Yeah, you cannot tell how many chinks are in the armor of the orc that's currently swinging a battle axe at you. You can identify 4. There's 2 behind each knee and 2 in each armpit. That's about it. Because that's about what you got in 6 seconds, especially under the stress of having a battle axe swung at your face hole. So keep those kinds of things in mind.
Or even if you really want to, get a stopwatch or like a timer for 6 seconds, hit the button, and then look around at every individual thing in your room and see how far you get before that timer buzzes.
Yep. And try to name them out loud and stuff like that. It's not very far.
I've tried it. It's not very far. And I can look around pretty quick. But that's more of just kind of a rough idea of how to measure this kind of thing. Because ultimately, you could just say, screw it, they can ask as many freaking questions as they want, no matter how detailed. And you can have them do rolls and stuff with it, too. There are games where I've run where I do that. So it's not really like a hard rule for you to follow.
Yeah, no. Like, sometimes the druid can, because they know a lot about plants, they can say, oh, hey, I have this specific ability that allows me to know a whole lot about plants. Okay, can you figure out? Can I tell what kind of plant is in that vase over there?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, sure. Give me a nature roll. Blah blah blah. That's your turn. Cool, but whatever.
Yeah, I don't know why you'd use it for that, but that is a pretty good example of trying to do something like that in the middle of initiative.
Yeah, it's kind of not useful.
No.
Maybe.
I mean, who knows? Like, I've had some people you asked what the fucking walls were made of, and it turned out to change how the combat worked. So who knows what can happen?
Yeah, it killed a dude straight up. Well, he's dead. Well,
so let's switch back over a little bit to some GM specific stuff. So one of the things that I would fully recommend is use as few spellcasters in your game as possible.
Yeah.
I usually prefer monsters with specific special abilities instead of like this caster who has access to 1st through 5th level spells. That's a lot of prep work that you got to do if you want to do that. And you know me, I'm not really that big on certain prep work. And this is one of those things.
Do that.
So this is great from what we mentioned earlier with like the cards that you have. If you're the GM, you have the cards of these NPCs laid out, so you have what spells they have access to without looking at their stat block, however big that is. You just be like, okay, I'm going to cast this turn, this next turn, etc., etc., and just do that.
Yeah, if you're going to do this for an enemy, make sure that if you're going to put that kind of time into that enemy, then that specific enemy is like a statted full character sheet NPC that is like a general for the big bad guy and stuff like that. That's when things like that come in handy. But if you've got 1d10 skeletons on the field and each of them can cast 12 spells for reasons that are completely asinine to the game. Because I've seen some demons that you can summon a
yeah.
demon and blah blah blah. They have these spells, and I don't use those spells because
I
unless it's
actually,
like a damaging spell or like a silence, then it's not really
I think those are
useful.
actually more useful to the players because what they're supposed to be doing is getting into some shit with these demons. So basically
Yeah,
make contracts and stuff with them. Which players, I don't know if they've ever seen anybody do that, but that's kind of, I feel like that's more what it's about. Um,
yeah.
but
I tried to get my players last game to make a deal with a demon, and they didn't do it.
I was gonna
I
let
kind of
you.
wanted one of them too.
You know the devil you fought. That was this. Is, I'm pulling back the curtain for Legends of Latir a little bit, but he was
Ooh.
totally on the level. Like
Oh
if
yeah, no.
if you had
Yeah.
made a deal with him, he would have honored that just as well, even though he actively doesn't like you guys. It was just that's the way law works, and
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. He was a lawful evil.
yeah, but he had all those spells too, and I just said, "Fuck it, whatever." He's gonna fight you guys with what he's got. I also picked a really easy devil to run. But
Yeah.
have your spells listed out, plan them in advance, so you're
Mhm.
not, and read over them as well. Like so that way you're not getting to the fight and you're like, "Oh shit, what's this spell? What does it do?" Don't do that. If you have to ask what a spell does when you see it for
Just
the
don't
first
use it.
time on a character sheet, they don't have access to that spell anymore. Their spell slot's been taken. Um,
Yeah.
at least that's a
But
quick way I do it.
yeah, like if you gotta come up with an NPC monster for them to fight because they went freaking instead of going north, they decided to go south, and you're like, all right, well, there's a cave down here. They delve through the cave, and it's like, oh, you find a. Let me flip through the monster real
Yeah,
quick. And
don't do that.
this thing sounds cool. Don't use its spell abilities. You're just gonna give yourself a migraine. It's
Yeah.
just not worth it. Another thing that you can do that will kind of speed things up a little bit is remove friendly fire from AoE spells so that the players aren't sitting down with their faces over the top of your game board and trying to figure out whether or not they can angle it just so it doesn't hit any of their homies, but hits as many enemies as possible. So, this isn't this
Yeah.
is Dungeons and Dragons. And if you use, grids and tiles and stuff, that's fine. If you don't, that is also
So
fine. But
here's why I recommend you do that because if you don't do that, the players are gonna sit down and do this anyway. They're gonna figure out
oh
how to
yeah,
if in the pile of people, they're gonna figure out how to maximize damage against your enemies.
but they'll do it for like 10
And they
minutes.
will figure out a way to not hit any of their homies either, and they will
Yeah.
take the time to do that. Now, there are some certain aspects of that are super fun, and I like to have that in the game. But if you're
Oh
running
yeah.
a like if you want to get like through if it's a combat heavy game, you really want to just get through them and like because the next encounter's right around the corner, we don't need to stick around and do this. Then you could just straight up say like AOE spells don't affect allies, and so if somebody casts a fireball in the middle of a big fucking room, only the enemies get hit. But just like this, because this is my GM philosophy, if you allow the players to do that, you get to do that too. So if your lich
Yeah.
chucks that same fireball into that same room, now none of the undead are hit, but the players are.
Yeah. This is one of those rules that can speed things along where players are concerned. Now, I don't personally ascribe to this
I almost
simply
never do
because
this.
I really like watching the players try to figure that stuff out. It shows that they're really engaged and they're paying attention to the board and they're trying to, strategize and plan and move around and, they're talking to each other like, all right, if you move over here and they move over there, then we can get this just perfect and it'll be awesome. I like
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
See,
But
I've enjoyed doing that myself from time to time, which is why I don't. Maybe myself, I wouldn't use this remove friendly fire from the game. But I mean, it's an option that
it is totally an option.
nobody's gonna be pissed off at you for making the game more fluid. And I'm definitely certain your players aren't gonna be pissed off at you that somebody who casts scorching or not scorching ray, flame, what the fuck, flamethrower or whatever. Somebody who
Yeah.
casts flamethrower, they're not gonna be mad that they don't hit their allies. They're gonna
Yeah,
be like,
no,
oh, thank God, I don't have to do this.
they are 100% of the time being like, fuck it. I'm doing it through my dude who just happens to be able to backflip over the top of it as I'm doing it. You can narrate it to be really cool and stuff like that too.
The reason why we put this in fact, is because so imagine this. Imagine exactly a 20-foot radius from a point. because when I'm using Fireball as the example because it's one of my favorite spells. Like most, people love it. It's fucking
Okay,
Fireball, man. So
Fireball.
it's got a 20-foot radius. So on a grid, that's very easy to do because you just have squares and all that. But like if you were in that universe, is it really that easy to do? If you're sitting there in a real battlefield that doesn't have this fun grid, how do you know where if you point at like a 20-foot area that encompasses the cleric that you're trying not to hit versus a 19-foot radius where it wouldn't hit the cleric? Can you discern that at a glance? Probably not.
Probably not.
What are the
Unless you're
exact
like,
dimensions of the room you are in without measuring it or knowing beforehand?
yeah, like it is unlikely for you to know whether or not you are going to cause any issues like that, unless you're playing like freaking earlier editions of D&D that were dungeon crawl heavy, where the DM is required to say, you walk into a room, it is exactly 20 foot by 15 feet. It is shaped like a blah, 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 blah.
I'll see. I mean, I'll throw in the foot measurements anyway, but
Yeah.
it's because I am the GM and I do know what the answers are and the exact dimensions are beforehand, and that really kind of gives you a decent scale for like what the players are imagining. That's kind of why I wanted to jump in there.
Yeah.
You remember back at the old place where we would basically measure stuff relative to how big the living room was compared to the living room.
Yeah.
Because it was like
Because
it was a
we never-
great size. It was like the perfect size living room for like
Yeah.
comparing it to real rooms in Dungeons and Dragons and shit.
Yeah, it was.
It's like
it was
it's
pretty
1.5
good.
times this room. It's like okay, it's easy to figure out.
Yeah, it is exactly half of this room. You see this line where the garage used to be? Yeah, it stops there. Okay, I know where that's at.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to visualize. You didn't have to give numbers all the time.
Yeah. And if you're using a visual system that doesn't necessarily have to have grids, because in real life, you want to try and create some immersion in your game. So in real life, there's not grids on the floor in this cave that you're walking through. But what you can do is a quick piece of string to do stuff like that. Just measure it out, the amount of space. We've covered this once before. Or you can actually go and get little plastic dials that are meant for wargaming, like for tabletop wargaming. And those will relatively be about the right size because everything runs off of a 1-inch system, I believe. I'm not 100% certain.
I
for
mean,
war games.
at that point, we don't have to worry about getting into the minutia. But I do think it's funny. Like back when I used to parlor LARP, we used to do it in a place that actually, conveniently enough, had a tile floor that we could use as a real person grid.
Yeah.
Which was great because it was like the perfect size on each of the tile. They were equidistant, like, and the same measurements and everything. And we were like, damn, that's so easy. I'm going to move 3 squares this way. And you would just walk 3 squares that way. And there was no need to dispute
kinda
where you
fun.
were.
Yep. I think that the college we used to go to had those too. And they're like exactly like
That's what I
3 or
meant.
4 feet.
I just didn't say the word college in that explanation. But, yeah.
Okay.
No, that's exactly what I'm thinking of, Xander.
Now I understand.
So one final thing, and this is a big thing that will really speed up your gameplay. And generally, this is one of the things I say shouldn't happen just in general. So don't let players have committees during a fight. What does this mean, Xander?
That means that when one person is taking their turn to do a thing, if they can't say, hey, do, then it is not acceptable. Because you can have your players sitting down, looking at the board, and having a 10, 15-minute conversation with each other about how they're going to organize where they're going to move.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, you don't have 10 to 15 minutes to think about this.
You don't even have 10 to 15 seconds to think about that in play.
You've got 6 seconds. If you can't convey that message within 6 seconds across the table, sorry, bro.
Let me elaborate a little bit more on this. So this is when it's your fighter's turn, and they're trying to figure out what to do. This is fine. Like the player needs to sit there and figure out what they're gonna do.
Yeah.
They probably should have had some of this planned already, and we'll assume they do. So they're sitting there and like, if I move here, I could probably do this. And then this is where the other players at the table jump in and be like, you should move here, which will let my character do this on the next turn, which will cause this to happen. And then you can move, after this guy's dead, if you kill him, you can move back here. And it's like, first of all, this isn't even the same player that's taking this turn anymore. And
Yeah, no.
second, this is completely ruining the immersion.
Yeah, you will probably come across players that are like this. It's a sad state of our community, but it happens, and probably more often than we really want to admit. But
It's a good trait if you are playing a meat grinder because you
oh yeah,
you want to do that at that point because the game is stacked against you. You need to stack yourselves against the game.
yeah, and if you have plenty of time, let's say you set aside 8 hours worth of game time, and the only thing you're going to do is like 2, maybe 3 combat sessions, and that's the thing that you do. Yeah, go for it. But in a classic one, you've got other things to worry about. You have detailed storylines, and there's other role play to be had. It's not feasible at that point.
And even regardless of how roleplay heavy or gameplay heavy it is, at the end of the day, at the very least, you are taking away autonomy from another player.
Yeah,
It's their character. How would you want it? How would you like it if they took your turn effectively, or made you feel bad that you took certain actions because it was character appropriate, or just because you thought it was the cool thing to do at the time? Like even regardless of character motivations, like that feels bad. So don't do it to
yeah,
people.
yeah. Imagine for a second you're sitting at your desk at your job, and you're working on stuff. You have a deadline to meet, and you've got this entire paragraph that you've just finished typing, and then over your shoulder you hear from one of your coworkers who's not doing their friggin' job for whatever reason. You know, if you completely reword these 2 sentences, I think it would go a lot better. Oh, also, those numbers, I think that they're completely wrong. You need to completely redo it. That guy's a
Yeah,
jackass.
and then
You
you're
know,
like, well,
like that
fine,
dude in the office.
It's like, fine, you
You
take this
fucking do it.
project then. You stand up from the desk, you fucking leave. Like, they clearly got it handled.
Yeah, yeah. They've clearly got a handle. You'll meet people like that in real life. So don't do that to your other players at the table. We don't like that shit at our jobs. Why would you want it around the game table where we're supposed to be having fun?
If you're not going to do it in real life, don't do it in fantasy. And
Yeah.
if you're going to do it in
If that's
fantasy,
your
maybe
fantasy,
probably not do it in real life, because generally all the fantasy stuff you shouldn't do. It's illegal and wrong.
it's very illegal. You can't carry a katana down the road and when someone insults your mother, chop his head off. That's not. You're not a real murder hobo, dude. And if you are, you're a serial killer. Please.
And if you are, like, thanks for listening to the podcast.
Thanks for listening to the podcast, though.
I'm surprised you got a hold of it.
Yeah, I know, right? How'd you get into that?
If you don't have anybody doing this, like no committees or whatever, this is something that you could also consider doing, and this is for a like specific player or players if you're having trouble with this, like on as a group thing. If people are taking way too long to either start up their turn or do anything, like if somebody, we're assuming they've already asked like the relevant questions and they're just sitting there deliberating on what to do, then here's something that I know some GMs do. I've never done this before. This is one of those things where I think it is a little too harsh, but I'm going to put it on here because it's important to note that it's a possibility. So,
Yeah.
since you don't have minutes out like in game to figure out what you're going to do, you definitely have minutes out of game to figure out what you're going to do, but don't go overboard. If people are starting to go overboard in your game like multiple times, like every time it gets to like any player, they just take forever to like get started, you could straight up put a timer on the table, like an hourglass or like a digital thing, and when it gets to their turn, you hit that button, and then they get to watch the timer tick down. However, they don't make it 6 seconds. Like
No, get like a
this is
1 minute
like
timer that
right.
or a 30-second timer you get from like some board games and things like that. Use one of those things. 30 seconds to a minute is plenty of time.
Right, because you didn't start this immediately when it got to their turn. It's not like, okay, it's the druid's turn, start, and then they have to ask you questions and go through that whole process. No, this is like they're done with that. You hit the button, and then they need to start narrating something. So even if it's just like, I'm gonna cast the spell, it's gonna be this spell. I'm gonna point it here and here. Like, I would give them a lot of leeway. As long as they start talking and start doing something, then I'd pretty much ignore the timer at that point. But if it gets to that 30 seconds or 1 minute and they haven't even like begun saying what they're going to do, that character's turn's delayed. They move down an initiative.
Yep.
They couldn't figure out what to do in play, so they had to wait.
Yeah. So, quick side note. Whenever you add a timer to a combat, just prepare for the fact that tension is about to go up, even if the other players aren't involved with it. So, yeah, just be mindful that timers can be really powerful, even if you're not having issues
Hmm.
with the timing of your game.
It
This
could
is
be a
kind of a
very
side note.
effective tool just to have. Oh no, I agree with that. Like, there
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 have
have
been
been
fun to
times
watch
where
the players go, oh!
even when you don't have a physical timer, if you're like narrating some kind of action, this is maybe like not happening in rounds. But like one example that I can remember from a game I ran was they were driving down the road, like this swampy road, in a wagon. They were out by themselves, and I described a suspicious looking lump that's like, pretty big off to the side of the road, but it's ahead of them. And so the players started deliberating about what to do. The wagon doesn't stop. They weren't the ones driving it, and they didn't say they stopped, so it keeps going. So they were deliberating, and I was like, the mound is now this close. And they were like, what? And it's like, yeah, you're still
Oh shit.
moving. And you're about to pass it, in fact. What do you do? And they eventually were just like, okay, we're not going to do anything. And I was like, okay, because that's a legitimate choice. So
Yeah.
I just let them roll by it, and there was a very tense moment as they passed the shambling mound, which was what that was. And it turns out that it didn't roll high enough on its terrible ass perception while it was asleep or unconscious, or however plant monsters work, to notice them going by. So there was no encounter with that. But if they had like attacked it or like started panicking or something, it probably would have alerted its attention, and then you would have had a real fight.
Yeah, because Shambling Mound sucks. We fought them before. They suck.
But yeah,
I
that's the
don't
way
like
you could
them.
use an in-game timer without actually having a physical timer. Just narrate the things happening, and then the more things happen, the more your characters are like, "Oh Jesus, we got to do something right now."
Gotta do so, or not do something right now.
Even though we spent this entire episode telling you how to speed up your combats, one caveat should be added. If you and your friends enjoy the time spent in lengthy combat, then keep doing what you're doing. It's not for any of us to say how you should spend your time, but if you find that you're slogging through the unfun minutia, then you could use the techniques from this episode to lighten the burden. That's it for this episode, so we want to hear from you. Is there anything we missed, or do you have techniques of your own that you want to share? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Starblade Studios until we see you next time on Playing God.
Later, man.